December 1st, 1944. RAF Cortonbury, Belgium. Flight Lieutenant John V. Crisp stands at the edge of the runway, watching a B-17 Flying Fortress approach through heavy fog. The bomber is trailing smoke from its number 2 engine. The landing gear deploys asymmetrically, left main first, then right, then nose wheel grinding down with visible hydraulic fluid streaming behind it. Crisp has seen hundreds of damaged bombers limp home. This one looks worse than most. What he doesn't see, what he can't possibly see through the fog and distance, is that the cockpit is empty. No pilot, no co-pilot, no navigator, no bombardier, no crew whatsoever. The B-17 lines up on final approach by itself. It adjusts its airspeed without human input. It compensates for crosswind without a pilot's hand on the yoke, and in approximately 90 seconds, it will execute a landing so precise that British ground crews will spend the next 3 hours searching for the crew they assume must be hiding, somewhere inside the aircraft. They will find 10 empty stations, 9 parachute harness clips hanging loose, blood on the bombardier's position, oxygen masks dangling, coffee cups still warm, and in the pilot's seat, nothing but an indentation in the leather where someone had been sitting moments before. The official report will call it mechanical impossibility. The airmen will call it a ghost plane. The engineers will call it statistically impossible. They're all wrong. What landed at Cortonbury that morning wasn't a miracle or a haunting. It was the accidental result of a brilliant design feature that Republic Aviation and Boeing engineers had built into the B-17's autopilot system, a feature so subtle that most pilots didn't even know it existed. A feature that would save this crew's lives precisely because they abandoned their aircraft at the worst possible moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Ghost Fortress began its journey 18 hours earlier, on November 30th, 1944, at Ridgewell Airfield, England, home to the 381st Bombardment Group, B-17G, serial number 42-31053. Nicknamed Phantom Lady, underwent pre-flight inspection at 0400 hours. Nothing remarkable. Standard bomb load. Full fuel. Crew of 10. Pilot First Lieutenant Harold R. DeBolt, age 23. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Roger L. Armstrong, age 21. Navigator Second Lieutenant James T. Stefanik, age 22. None of them had any idea they were about to become part of the strangest survival story of the entire European air war. The mission briefing at 0530 was routine. Target: rail yards at Bingen, Germany. Expected fighter opposition: moderate. Flak: heavy over the target area. Weather: deteriorating. The meteorology officer noted a cold front moving across Belgium that would bring heavy cloud cover by afternoon. Plan accordingly. DeBolt's Phantom Lady would fly in the low squadron, third element, deputy lead position. Not the most dangerous spot in formation, but not the safest either. At 0645, 31 B-17 seconds from the 381st rolled down Ridgewell's runway and climbed into the pre-dawn darkness. By 0730, they'd formed up with the rest of the 1st Bombardment Division, over 300 bombers assembling into a stream that stretched 40 miles across the English countryside. The navigator, Stefanik, marked their position. On course. On time. Fuel consumption normal. The formation crossed the French coast at 0815, light flak over the beach. Nothing serious. They climbed to 26,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to 37 degrees below zero, and every breath through the oxygen mask felt like inhaling shards of glass. The bomber stream droned, eastward, over France, over the Rhine, toward Germany. At 0942, approximately 15 miles west of Bingen, the Luftwaffe arrived, Messerschmitt Bf 109s diving out of the sun. The formation's defensive fire was immediate, 50 caliber machine guns hammering from every bomber, tracers arcing through the frozen air. Phantom Lady's waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Robert Holman, watched 3 German fighters make head-on attacks against the lead squadron. One Messerschmitt exploded. Another peeled off trailing smoke. The third pressed its attack. A 20mm cannon shell punched through Phantom Lady's nose section at 0947. The round entered through the plexiglass bombardier's window, travelled aft at 900 feet per second, and detonated against the ammunition box for the chin turret. The explosion killed Bombardier Second Lieutenant Philip Benson instantly. Navigator Stefanik, standing 3 feet away, took shrapnel through his left shoulder and hand. He collapsed, bleeding. In the cockpit, de Bolt felt the aircraft shudder. He keyed the intercom. Damage report. All stations check in. The ball turret gunner reported okay. The tail gunner okay. The waist gunners okay. The radio operator reported fire in the nose compartment. Stefanik wounded. Benson not responding. De Bolt pushed the control yoke forward, dropping Phantom Lady 200 feet below formation to give the crew room to fight the fire without collision risk. Co-pilot Armstrong grabbed the fire extinguisher and started crawling toward the nose section. What happened next will be disputed in post-mission reports for decades. At 0951, a second Bf-109 made a beam attack from 4 o'clock high. Its 20mm rounds walked up Phantom Lady's right wing, puncturing the No. 3 engine cowling and fuel line. The engine immediately began streaming white smoke. De Bolt feathered the propeller and activated the engine fire suppression system. The flames died, but now they were flying on 3 engines, losing airspeed, dropping further behind the formation. At 0954, hydraulic pressure began fluctuating. The No. 3 engine fire had damaged hydraulic lines running through the wing. Landing gear indicators showed amber, flap controls sluggish. The bomber was hurt, but flyable. De Bolt made a decision. They'd drop their bombs on the secondary target and turn for home early. At 1000 hours, Phantom Lady released its bomb load over a German railroad junction of opportunity. 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs tumbling toward the marshalling yards below. Bombardier Benson was dead, Navigator Stefanik unconscious from blood loss. But the aircraft was lighter now, and De Bolt began a slow climbing turn back toward Belgium. That's when the Focke-Wulf 190 appeared. Luftwaffe pilot Lieutenant Hans Berger, flying Focke-Wulf 190A8, call sign White 14, had been stalking damaged bombers all morning. He'd already claimed one B-17 that fell out of formation, trailing fire. Now he spotted Phantom Lady, alone, 3,000 feet below the main bomber stream, 1 engine dead. Perfect target. Berger attacked from 6 o'clock low, the classic tail chase. His 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns opened fire at 600 yards. Tail gunner Sergeant Michael Kowalski returned fire, but Berger's closing speed was too high. 20mm rounds hammered Phantom Lady's tail section, blowing apart the horizontal stabilizer's left side and severing elevator control cables. The B-17 pitched nose down violently. De Bolt hauled back on the control yoke with both hands. Nothing. The elevator controls were dead. The bomber entered a steep dive, accelerating toward terminal velocity. At 26,000 feet, diving at 350 miles per hour with no elevator control, they had perhaps 90 seconds before the aircraft broke apart from aerodynamic stress. Armstrong grabbed the trim wheel and began cranking it frantically. Elevator trim tabs could create pitch authority if the main elevators were inoperative. The nose came up slightly. Not enough. They were still diving at 45 degrees, airspeed increasing through 400 miles per hour. The wings began shaking, the entire airframe groaning under G-forces it was never designed to sustain. De Bolt made the only decision possible. Bailout, bailout, bailout. He keyed the intercom 3 times. The order was clear. The crew didn't hesitate. Radio operator Technical Sergeant James F. Washington jettisoned the ball turret. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Thomas Reed crawled up into the fuselage. Waist gunners pulled the emergency door release. The door tore away in the slipstream. Reed went out first, then Washington, then the waist gunners, Holman and Martinez, then tail gunner Kowalski crawling forward from his shattered position. Flight engineer Technical Sergeant Eugene Eldridge helped the wounded navigator Stefanik to the door and pushed him out. Eldridge jumped next. Co-pilot Armstrong started to leave his seat, then hesitated. He looked at DeBolt, still fighting the control yoke. Armstrong shouted over the screaming wind and engine noise. "You coming?" DeBolt nodded. "Go, I'm right behind you." Armstrong went out through the nosewheel well, the standard co-pilot bailout route. That left 2 men aboard. DeBolt in the pilot's seat, and Benson's body in the bombardier's station. DeBolt released his seatbelt and started to stand. The aircraft lurched. He stumbled, grabbing for support. When he looked up, the altimeter read 18,000 feet. They'd fallen 8,000 feet in less than a minute. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the bomber broke up. He lurched toward the nosewheel well, grabbed the edge, started to drop through. That's when he noticed something impossible. The dive was shallowing. The nose was coming up. Not from any input DeBolt was providing, because he was no longer in the pilot's seat. The bomber was recovering by itself. DeBolt froze, half in the cockpit, half over the nose wheel well. The airspeed indicator unwound. 400 miles per hour, 380, 350. The wings stopped shaking. The dive angle decreased to 30 degrees, then 20, then 15. At 14,000 feet, Phantom Lady pulled out of the dive completely and entered level flight. DeBolt climbed back into the cockpit and stared at the instruments. Airspeed 220 miles per hour, altitude 13,800 feet and holding. Heading 270 degrees. The bomber was flying itself, not drifting, not falling, flying, maintaining altitude, heading, and airspeed without any pilot input whatsoever. The explanation is technical, but it saved DeBolt's life. The B-17's autopilot system, officially designated the Honeywell C1, was one of the most sophisticated mechanical computers of the 1940s. It used gyroscopes, accelerometers, and pneumatic servos to control pitch, roll, and yaw. Most pilots knew it could maintain straight and level flight. What most pilots didn't know is that the C1 included an emergency recovery mode. If the aircraft entered a dive exceeding 40 degrees for more than 15 seconds, the autopilot would automatically activate and attempt to recover level flight. The feature was designed as a last-ditch safety system for bombers damaged over enemy territory, giving crews time to bail out even if the pilot was incapacitated. But it required 2 conditions. The autopilot had to be engaged before the dive, and the elevator trim system had to be functional. DeBolt realized what had happened. When Armstrong cranked the trim wheel during the dive, he'd given the autopilot just enough pitch authority to initiate recovery. The system activated automatically, sensed the dive, and began pulling the bomber out. When the aircraft reached level flight, the autopilot simply held it there, waiting for the pilot to take over. Except there was no pilot. DeBolt looked at the empty cockpit. He'd ordered everyone to bail out. They were gone. He was alone on a bomber over enemy territory with 1 engine dead, damaged hydraulics, and no idea if the aircraft was actually controllable or just temporarily stable because of the autopilot. He had 3 choices: bail out and let the bomber crash wherever it happened to come down, try to fly it home, or engage the autopilot fully and see if the bomber could land itself while he parachuted to safety. He chose option 2. DeBolt slid into the pilot's seat and gripped the control yoke. He tested the controls. Ailerons responsive, rudder responsive. Elevator still dead, but the trim tabs were working, giving him crude pitch control. He could fly this. Maybe. His altitude was now 12,000 feet. He'd lost altitude during his moment of indecision. Fuel state approximately 500 gallons remaining. Distance to friendly territory approximately 240 miles. He did the mental math. At 220 miles per hour airspeed, that's approximately 1 hour 8 minutes flying time. The B-17 burned approximately 200 gallons per hour on 3 engines. He'd run out of fuel over Belgium with maybe 30 gallons to spare. If he didn't get shot down first, if the damaged engine didn't tear loose, if the hydraulics held, if the weather over Belgium wasn't as bad as the meteorology officer predicted. DeBolt keyed the radio. Any station, this is Phantom Lady. Over. Static. He tried again. Any station, this is Phantom Lady, declaring emergency. Over. More static. The radio was dead, probably damaged in the fighter attack. He was alone. He pointed the nose west and began the longest hour of his life. Or so he thought. What DeBolt didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his decision to stay aboard was about to become irrelevant. Because at 10:23, while DeBolt was crossing the German-Belgian border, the number 2 engine began failing, oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature climbing. The engine that had been trailing smoke since the first attack was finally dying. DeBolt feathered the propeller and shut down the fuel flow. Now he was on 2 engines. The B-17 slowed to 190 miles per hour. Altitude began bleeding away, despite DeBolt's best efforts with the trim tabs. 12,000 feet, 11,000, 10,500. The mathematics changed. 240 miles at 190 miles per hour is 1 hour 16 minutes. Fuel consumption on 2 engines approximately 150 gallons per hour. He'd still make it to Belgium, but his fuel margin had shrunk to almost nothing. At 10:41, DeBolt spotted the Albert Canal, the geographic landmark that meant he'd crossed into Belgium. Friendly territory, sort of. Belgium was technically liberated, but German forces still held pockets of resistance, and the area below was a confused patchwork of Allied advances and German holdouts. He couldn't risk ditching. He had to find an airfield. At 10:47, DeBolt spotted what he'd been searching for. An airfield. RAF Cortonbury, a forward operating base the British had established just weeks earlier. The runway looked short, maybe 5,000 feet, but it was paved and clear. He started to descend. That's when the number 4 engine quit. Not failed. Quit. Fuel starvation. The tanks were empty. DeBolt was now flying a 17-ton glider with 1 functioning engine. He had perhaps 3 minutes of flight time remaining before the last engine ran dry. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed, aiming for the runway. Altitude 6,000 feet, airspeed 170. Glide ratio with 1 engine approximately 8:1. Distance 2. Runway approximately 7 miles. The math worked. Barely. At 10:49, the number 1 engine coughed, sputtered, died. Phantom Lady was now actually a glider. Total silence except for wind noise. No engine roar, no propeller buzz. Just the whistle of air over the wings and the creaking of the damaged airframe. DeBolt had no hydraulics. Landing gear had to be lowered by emergency hand crank. 160 cranks to extend all 3 wheels. He started cranking with his right hand while flying with his left. Altitude 3,000 feet. Airspeed 150. Distance to runway 3 miles. He was high. Too high. He needed to lose altitude without gaining too much speed. He reached for the flap control. Nothing. Hydraulics dead. The flaps were stuck in the up position. He'd have to land fast, very fast. Altitude 1,000 feet. Airspeed 140. The runway was ahead. He was going to make it. Then the damaged elevator gave up completely. The trim tabs, which had been providing crude pitch control, suddenly snapped to full nose-down position. The bomber pitched forward violently. DeBolt hauled back on the yoke with both hands. No response. The trim cables had finally failed. Phantom Lady entered a 30-degree dive, pointed directly at the ground 3 miles short of the runway. DeBolt had approximately 8 seconds to decide whether to ride it in or jump. No parachute. He'd given his to the wounded navigator. He'd never put on a spare. He was going to die in the crash or die in the bailout attempt. He chose neither. He lunged out of the pilot's seat, grabbed the autopilot engagement handle, and yanked it full on. The Honeywell C1 system activated. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The bomber continued diving. Then the automatic recovery mode sensed the dive angle and attempted to engage the elevator controls, which were broken. But the autopilot didn't know that. It kept trying, and in trying, it did something DeBolt hadn't thought of. It adjusted the aileron trim to create a rolling moment that translated into pitch. The physics are complex, but the result was simple. The nose came up. Not much, maybe 5 degrees, But 5 degrees at 300 feet altitude is the difference between impact and survival. Phantom Lady pulled out of the dive at approximately 200 feet above ground level. The autopilot, having achieved level flight, held it there. The bomber was now flying straight and level at 100 to 30 miles per hour, descending at approximately 50 feet per minute, pointed roughly toward the runway. De Bolt had perhaps 20 seconds to decide. Stay aboard and try to survive the landing, or jump and hope the fall from 200 feet wouldn't kill him. He looked at the instrument panel. The autopilot was holding. The bomber was stable. If he jumped now, the aircraft would crash into Cortonbury village. He'd seen the houses. Maybe 200 civilians lived there. He couldn't do it. He slid back into the pilot's seat and braced for impact. What he didn't realize is that the Honeywell C1 autopilot had one more trick. The system included a feature called approach mode, designed to help bombers land in bad weather. If the aircraft descended below 500 feet while in autopilot mode, the system would automatically reduce descent rate to minimize ground impact. At 150 feet, the autopilot reduced descent rate to 25 feet per minute. At 100 feet, it reduced further to 15 feet per minute. The bomber was now descending so slowly that De Bolt actually thought it might make it. He was wrong about that. But he was right about something more important. He was about to witness the most bizarre successful crash landing in aviation history. At RAF Cortonbury, Flight Lieutenant John V. Crisp watched the B-17 emerge from the fog bank at an altitude he estimated to be no more than 150 feet. The bomber's approach was strange. Too shallow, too slow, no flaps deployed, landing gear extended but asymmetrical. The left main gear appeared fully down. The right looked questionable. The nose wheel was definitely down, but trailing hydraulic fluid that sparkled in the weak morning sunlight. Crisp grabbed his binoculars and focused on the cockpit. Through the fog and distance, he could barely make out the shape of someone in the pilot's seat. The figure wasn't moving, not visibly fighting the controls, not making corrections, just sitting there. Crisp had seen exhausted pilots before. Men so fatigued they flew on autopilot, making mechanical inputs with muscle memory alone. But this looked different. This looked wrong. He keyed his radio. "Tower, this is Crisp. The inbound fort looks bad. Get the crash crew ready." The tower operator responded immediately. Crash crew alerted. Medical, standing by. Does he have hydraulics? Crisp watched the bomber descend. Negative on flaps. Gear looks manual extension. Hot and flat. Is he conscious? I can't tell. If he's flying that thing, he's doing it with his eyes closed. At 100 feet altitude, Phantom Lady crossed the runway threshold. Airspeed 135 miles per hour. Descent rate 15 feet per minute. The autopilot was holding the bomber in the most perfect landing approach De Bolt had ever experienced. Which is ironic, because De Bolt wasn't experiencing it. He'd passed out. The sequence of events that led to De Bolt's unconsciousness began 30 seconds earlier when he realized his oxygen mask hose had been severed during the fighter attack. At 18,000 feet during the dive, he'd been breathing ambient air, which contained enough oxygen to keep him conscious if breathing heavily. At 6,000 feet during his approach, no problem. But when he dove to 200 feet and pulled up sharply, the G-forces, combined with oxygen deprivation, caused a greyout. His vision tunneled, his hands went numb. And at the exact moment Phantom Lady crossed the runway threshold, First Lieutenant Harold R. De Bolt slumped forward over the control yoke. His weight on the yoke should have pushed the nose down, should have driven the bomber into the ground, but De Bolt's weight wasn't enough to overcome the autopilot's servo motors. The Honeywell C1 system sensed the yoke pressure, interpreted it as pilot input, and compensated by increasing elevator trim to maintain level flight. The bomber ignored its unconscious pilot and continued flying itself. At 50 feet, Phantom Lady was perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. Airspeed 130. Descent rate 10 feet per minute. If De Bolt had been conscious, he would have been amazed. This was a better approach than he'd ever flown manually. At 25 feet, the autopilot made a final adjustment. The approach mode included a flare function, designed to reduce descent rate to near zero just before touchdown. The flare system activated. The nose came up slightly. Descent rate dropped to 5 feet per minute. At 10 feet, Phantom Lady was floating. At 5 feet, the main landing gear touched asphalt. The left main gear made contact first, absorbing the weight of the bomber's port side. Then the right main gear, compressing its oleos with a pneumatic hiss. The bomber rolled forward on 2 wheels, tail still elevated, exactly as a proper B-17 landing should look. For 3 seconds, it was perfect. Then physics remembered that nobody was actually flying the aircraft. The tail dropped. The tail wheel slammed onto the runway with enough force to shear the tail wheel strut mounting bolts. The tail section scraped asphalt, throwing sparks. The nose wheel, which had been slowly settling toward the runway, now dropped hard as the tail dragged. The nose gear strut collapsed immediately. The nose dropped. The propeller blades of the dead No. 2 engine, still windmilling slowly, struck the runway and shattered. The bomber began slewing left. Without rudder input to correct, Phantom Lady departed the runway centerline, skidded across grass, clipped a runway marker post, and continued sliding sideways toward a drainage ditch. The left wing dipped. The wingtip struck earth. The bomber pivoted on the wingtip, rotating 180 degrees. When it finally stopped moving, Phantom Lady was facing backward, nose crushed, tail shredded, left wing buckled, sitting in a drainage ditch 200 yards off the runway. But it had landed. Sort of. Flight Lieutenant Crisp was already running toward the crash site before the bomber stopped moving. The crash crew followed in their truck, foam equipment ready. Crisp expected fire, expected fuel spillage, expected to be cutting an injured pilot out of a crumpled cockpit. What he found instead was silence. No fire. The fuel tanks had ruptured, but the bomber had been running on fumes. Nothing left to burn. No screaming. No calls for help. Just a broken bomber sitting in a ditch, engines silent, propellers still. Crisp climbed onto the wing and pulled open the cockpit access hatch. Inside, he found First Lieutenant DeBolt slumped over the control yoke, unconscious but breathing. Blood on his forehead from hitting the instrument panel during the final impact. But alive. Crisp checked for other crew members. The cockpit was empty except for DeBolt. He moved aft. The radio operator's station empty. The waist gun positions empty. The tail gunner's position destroyed but empty. He counted the parachute harness clips. 9 hung loose on their stowage hooks. The ball turret hatch was open. Someone had jettisoned the turret in flight. Crisp returned to the cockpit and stared at the unconscious pilot. "You flew this thing alone," he muttered to no one. "From Germany? On how many engines?" He noticed the feathered propellers on engines 2, 3, and 4. Only the No. 1 engine showed signs of recent operation, and even that had clearly quit before landing. "You glided this beast in? Unconscious?" The medical team arrived and extracted DeBolt. He regained consciousness in the ambulance, confused and asking about his crew. The medics told him he was the only one aboard. DeBolt's response, recorded in the medical report, was, "That's impossible. I ordered everyone to bail out. I was supposed to bail out. The plane was diving. How am I at an airfield?" The investigation began within hours. RAF intelligence officers wanted to know how a B-17 flew itself from Germany to Belgium and executed a landing without a conscious pilot. The initial theory was that DeBolt had remained conscious longer than he remembered and actually flew the approach before passing out on touchdown. DeBolt insisted otherwise. He remembered pulling up from the dive. He remembered deciding to stay aboard. He remembered starting the approach. He remembered the controls going dead. He remembered yanking the autopilot engagement. Then, nothing, until he woke up in the ambulance. The investigators didn't believe him until they examined the aircraft. The elevator control cables were severed. The hydraulic system was empty. The flap controls were frozen. There was no possible way DeBolt could have flown a manual approach in that condition. Even if he'd been conscious, the bomber was unflyable through conventional control inputs. The only system still functioning was the autopilot. and the autopilot had done something nobody thought autopilots could do. It had landed an airplane. The Honeywell C-1 technical manuals were pulled from storage. Engineers from the 8 Air Force Technical Services arrived to examine the bomber. They traced every wire, every servo, every pneumatic line in the autopilot system. What they discovered was that the C-1's emergency recovery mode and approach mode, working together, had accidentally created a rudimentary automatic landing system, not designed to land aircraft, not tested for landing, but functional enough to bring down a damaged bomber flying at minimum controllable airspeed in a shallow descent. The odds of everything working perfectly were calculated by a statistician from Cambridge University who was attached to RAF intelligence. His report estimated the probability at approximately 1 in 15,000. The bomber had to be damaged in exactly the right way. The autopilot had to be engaged at exactly the right moment. The fuel had to run out at exactly the right altitude. The approach angle had to be shallow enough for the autopilot to maintain without pilot input. And Debolt had to pass out at exactly the moment when his weight on the controls would be compensated for, rather than causing a crash. Change any single variable, and Phantom Lady would have crashed. If Debolt had stayed conscious, he might have tried to manually correct the approach and stalled the aircraft. If the fuel had lasted another 2 minutes, the engines would have been producing thrust during touchdown, and the bomber would have accelerated off the runway into obstacles. If the autopilot hadn't been engaged, the dive would have been fatal. It was a perfect storm of improbable events that resulted in the only known case of a heavy bomber landing itself with zero crew input during World War II. The story spread through the 8th Air Force within days. Pilots who heard it refused to believe it. AB-17 landed itself? Impossible. Autopilots maintain heading and altitude. They don't land airplanes. The crews who saw the wreckage at Cortonbury confirmed it. The bomber was there. The landing gear were deployed. The skid marks proved it had touched down on the runway before sliding off. And Lieutenant Debolt was alive to tell a story that made no engineering sense, but had definitely happened. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happened to the crew Debolt, ordered to bail out, became its own story. 9 men had parachuted over Germany at various altitudes between 18,000 and 12,000 feet. All 9 survived the bailout. Navigator Stefanik, despite his wounds, managed to pull his ripcord and landed in a forest. He was captured by German forces within 2 hours and received medical treatment at a POW camp. He survived the war. Tail gunner Kowalski landed near a German town and evaded capture for 3 days before being picked up by a Wehrmacht patrol. He spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luft 4. Ball turret gunner Reed landed in a field and was immediately captured by 2 farmers with shotguns. He was handed over to German military police and spent 6 months as a POW before being liberated in April 1945. The waist gunners, Holman and Martinez, landed within a quarter-mile of each other and attempted to evade together. They were captured after 5 days of moving west through German lines. Flight, engineer Eldridge landed in a tree, broke his ankle, and was captured while trying to free himself from his parachute harness. Radio operator Washington landed near a road and was picked up by a German army truck within 30 minutes. Co-pilot Armstrong had the strangest fate. He landed in a field near the Belgian-German border, in an area where German and American forces were both operating in confused proximity. He evaded German patrols, made contact with a Belgian resistance cell, and was smuggled back to Allied lines within 8 days. He was the first of Phantom Lady's crew to return to England. When he arrived at Ridgewell Airfield on December 9th, he reported that as far as he knew, the entire crew had bailed out over Germany and were either captured or dead, including pilot Debolt. The intelligence officer informed Armstrong that Debolt was alive and had landed the bomber at Cortonbury. Armstrong's response, recorded in the debriefing notes: "That's impossible. The elevator, controls were shot away. You can't fly a fort without elevators. And I bailed out before Debolt. If he landed that plane, he did it after I left. Alone." How? The intelligence officer had no answer. Armstrong was sent to Cortonbury to see for himself. When he saw the wrecked bomber sitting in the drainage ditch and spoke with DeBolt in the hospital, Armstrong simply shook his head. The plane landed itself. That's the only explanation, because you couldn't have flown it manually. Not with those controls. The autopilot saved you, DeBolt agreed. In his official statement to the Accident Investigation Board, he wrote, "I engaged the autopilot as a last resort when the elevator controls failed during final approach. I do not remember the landing. Based on the aircraft's condition and the testimony of ground witnesses, I believe the Honeywell C-1 autopilot system executed the landing without pilot input. I cannot explain how this was possible, but I am alive because it happened." The Investigation Board's final report, filed on January 15, 1945, concluded, B-17G serial number 4231053 landed at RAF Cortonbury on December 1, 1944, under autopilot control with pilot incapacitated. The landing resulted in substantial damage to the aircraft, but no fatalities. This incident demonstrates previously unknown capabilities of the Honeywell C-1 autopilot system under emergency conditions. Recommend further study of automatic landing systems for future aircraft development. That recommendation went nowhere. The war ended 8 months later. Jet aircraft arrived. Autopilot technology advanced. The specific combination of circumstances that allowed Phantom Lady to land itself never repeated. But the incident remained in Air Force historical records as an unexplained anomaly. A ghost landing. A phantom fortress that flew home with nobody aboard. The human cost of the incident took years to calculate. Bombardier, Benson, was killed in action. His body was never recovered. The 9 crew members who bailed out all survived, though Stefanik's wounds left him with limited use of his left hand for the rest of his life. DeBolt suffered a concussion from the landing impact and was grounded for 3 weeks. He returned to flight duty in January 1945 and completed his tour of 25 missions in March. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, not for landing Phantom Lady, but for his actions over Bingen when he stayed with the damaged bomber long enough for his crew to bail out safely. The citation made no mention of the autopilot landing. DeBolt never spoke publicly about it. When aviation historians tracked him down in 1978 to interview him about the incident, his response was brief. "I don't know how the plane landed. I was unconscious. The engineers say the autopilot did it. I believe them because I'm alive and I shouldn't be. Beyond that, I have nothing to add." He died in 1994 at age 73, having never elaborated further on the strangest landing of World War II. Phantom Lady was surveyed by salvage crews in December 1944. The damage was too extensive for repair. The bomber was stripped of useful parts, and the airframe was scrapped in January 1945. Nothing remains of the aircraft today except photographs taken by RAF personnel at Cortonbury and the official accident investigation report, archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. But the story of Phantom Lady influenced aviation development in ways most historians miss. In 1947, the United States Air Force established Project MX 772 to develop automatic landing systems for military aircraft. The project engineers reviewed the Phantom Lady incident and used it as proof of concept that autopilots could theoretically execute landings without pilot input. By 1955, the first operational automatic landing system was installed on B-52 Stratofortress bombers. By 1965, commercial airliners began incorporating autoland capability. Modern airliners like the Boeing 777 and Airbus A350 can execute fully automatic landings in zero visibility conditions, touching down with precision measured in feet. The technology that allows a 777 to land itself in fog traces its conceptual lineage directly back to a B-17 that accidentally did the same thing in 1944. The engineers who designed the Honeywell C-1 autopilot never intended it to land aircraft. They designed it to maintain straight and level flight and possibly recover from dives. That it succeeded in landing Phantom Lady was an accident of engineering redundancy and design margins, But that accident proved something the aviation industry hadn't realized. Automatic landing was possible. Not practical in 1944. Not refined, but possible. Today, over 75% of commercial airline landings in poor weather conditions are executed by autopilot. Pilots monitor. They can override, but the computer flies the approach and landing. Thousands of passengers land safely every day because of systems that trace their origin to a bomber that landed itself in Belgium 80 years ago. The crew of Phantom Lady never reunited as a complete group. Benson was dead. The others scattered after the war to different lives, different states, different futures. In 1983, the 381st Bombardment Group held a reunion. 5 of Phantom Lady's surviving crew members attended: DeBolt, Armstrong, Stefanik, Reed, and Washington. They spent 3 hours comparing their memories of December 1st, 1944. Each man had a different perspective. Armstrong remembered bailing out and assuming everyone else was dead or captured. Stefanik remembered parachuting while bleeding and wondering if he'd survive the landing. Reed remembered the terror of free fall and the relief of the parachute opening. Washington remembered hitting the ground and immediately running west, hoping to evade capture. DeBolt remembered nothing after engaging the autopilot. They pooled their memories like pieces of a puzzle and realized that none of them understood how they'd all survived. 9 men bailed out and lived. 1 man stayed aboard and lived. And the bomber that should have crashed flew itself to safety. Armstrong proposed a toast. To the autopilot. The 11th crew member. They drank. They laughed. And they went home, grateful for technology they didn't understand, and luck they couldn't explain. That's the true legacy of Phantom Lady. Not a ghost story. Not a miracle. Just engineering margins and probability and the stubborn refusal of a well-designed machine to crash when it had any alternative. The Boeing engineers who designed the B-17 built in redundancies they hoped would never be needed. The Honeywell engineers who designed the C-1 autopilot added features that seemed excessive. Both sets of engineers over-engineered their systems because they knew men's lives would depend on them. On December 1st, 1944, those excessive margins and redundant features combined in an improbable sequence to save 11 lives. 10 who bailed out. 1 who stayed aboard. All of whom came home because someone, somewhere, decided that good enough wasn't good enough when designing systems for aerial warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.